Hey everyone, I'm Walt, one of the High Rock pastors. My wife Jen and I moved to the Boston area in 2009. Up until that point, we had been in Maryland our entire lives. We grew up there, went to college there, got married there. Pretty much everything we knew and loved was in the old line state, and that included our friends. We had amazing groups of friends down there with rich histories, countless hours spent together, and leaving them behind was going to be tough. But the time had come for a change, and we were up for it. We were social people, we're extroverts. Jen, she can make great conversation. I can stand there, put out the vibe. This was going to be fun. And for our first few years in Boston, we made tons of great connections. We were in a small group. We had people over for dinner. We went to parties and hangouts. We were making friends, and not just surface level acquaintances either. We were going deep with these people, sharing about our lives, our marriage, our career challenges, our hopes for the future. It was really good stuff. But then something happened that I wasn't expecting. And it came to a head one night. I was watching a comedy about a guy who was engaged, but didn't have any guy friends who he could ask to be the best man at his wedding. And so he set out on this quest to befriend a guy. And as I was watching this, it slowly dawned on me, I was feeling really sad. And I was like, what's going on? Why am I so bummed out watching this comedy? And then it clicked. I'm that guy. I have no friends. The thing that I wasn't expecting about Boston was that people leave. Like, a lot. So after a number of years putting in the work to build real friendships, I looked around and realized that I had nothing to show for it. All the guys I had gotten close to had moved away. They graduated from school, took a job somewhere else, wanted to get back closer to family, or just live somewhere more affordable. All good reasons. But I just wasn't expecting the revolving door quite like this. And that began to have an effect on me. I just got tired always having to kickstart new friendships. Growing close to people requires work. It's good and important work, but when you're doing it all the time, it just gets exhausting. And I realized it was getting harder for me to trust people with the more vulnerable parts of my life because I knew they were just going to bounce in a little while anyway. If I was going to do the difficult work of being vulnerable, which is often scary and uncomfortable anyway, I wanted to make sure that it was worth it. More often than not, it didn't feel that way. One day after I had been on staff at High Rock for a few years, a leader in the church and I were having coffee. I had known him for a while at this point, and at one point he looked me in the eye and he said, "Walt, I just feel like you were really hard to know." And that completely took me by surprise, because for my whole life, I had thought of myself differently. Eager for friendship, eager for depth. But something in me was changing. I was becoming what I had always feared, a cold New Englander. I was realizing that, for me, friendships were becoming disposable. Commodities. Nice to have, but since I couldn't really depend on them, I'm going to prioritize other things. My work, my marriage and family relationships, I was stuck with those. My own comfort, fitness, or rest, that's what I was going to order my life around. And if friends came into those spheres, and great, I was still all about having a good time with people. But I was prepared to walk away or be walked away from. What was the point in navigating conflict or differences or schedules if time was just ticking down anyway? I might as well just look out for myself. Maybe you have also felt fatigued by the constant relational turnover in Boston or other fast-moving urban areas like New York or LA. Or maybe you've gotten past the transient life stage and have settled down with work and family life and feel so pulled in so many directions that you just don't have time for friendships. There's just no margin for it. And if you're newly retired or an empty nester, maybe you're feeling like it's time to get up and go. Wherever we are in life, we will always find reasons to keep people at a distance or prioritize our own desires over meaningful relationships. And to be fair, that tendency definitely existed in me well before coming to Boston. In high school, I stole my best friend's girl because best friends will come and go, but a high school girlfriend, that'll last forever, right? How often will we choose something for the benefit of ourselves over the benefit of a friend? A lot of times it's just easier for me to choose me. And eventually I felt like I had arrived at this place of equilibrium. I had friends, people I enjoyed being around, but we weren't all that deep. There was a handful of people I did trust with the harder parts of my life, but honestly, we didn't see each other all that much. We were just busy and consumed with our own things. And when we had some margin, we just wanted to crash. My friendship situation wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. It was okay. It was working, sort of. And I wonder how many of you would say something similar. But what if, I don't know, there were some kind of global crisis that pretty much cut us off from everyone? No more chatter with colleagues, no more seeing friends in the gym, no more play dates or dinner parties. Would our okay friendships still be working for us? Or would we find out the hard way that we were relationally ill-equipped to handle what was being thrown at us? Well, as you know, we don't have to wonder what the answer would be, because that is what our reality has been like for the last year. Like me, you've probably learned some things about your friendships, their durability, their depth, their dedication, and I really, really hope that there were some bright spots. If not this overarching theme that you were there for your friends and that your friends were there for you. But I also know that when hundreds of high rockers responded to our spiritual health survey earlier this year, 56% of us reported a significant increase in loneliness. I know we are desperate to get back to our regular rhythms of gathering and meeting, being able to hang out on Friday nights, have birthday parties in our homes. It'll be so good. But if we don't change the way that we are connecting, the way that we relate to our friends, then the amount of times that we connect and relate won't really matter. It will simply paper over the cracks. And when the next crisis rolls around, maybe not a global one, maybe a personal one, we might find ourselves back in that place of loneliness. What is the state of friendship in your life? I've shared a little bit about my life, and maybe you could share a little bit about yours at home or in the chat. Feel free to press pause if you want to have more extended time for conversation. Welcome back. I don't know if you resonated with any of what I shared, but I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want something different for my future and for my friendships. I need to learn how to be a better friend. And thankfully, the scriptures have so much to teach us about friendship. And today's passage is one of my favorites on this topic because it displays a level of friendship that is so radically different from what's common today that, honestly, it makes me a little uncomfortable, and I think that's a good thing. Our story centers around the friendship between two young men, David and Jonathan. David, as you may know, becomes the greatest king in Israel's history and is the ancestor of Jesus. But his journey to the throne was very unusual, full of twists and turns. He had humble beginnings. He started out as a shepherd boy, a nobody, until God intervened. And it was actually Jonathan who was next in line for the crown. Jonathan was the son of King Saul and the rightful heir to the kingdom, but all of that changed. King Saul was on his way out the door. He was simply unfit to rule, and a whole other sermon could be preached on how his lack of connection with God negatively affected his leadership. God had chosen a new king, a man after God's own heart, and that was David. David skyrocketed to popularity by defeating the giant Philistine Goliath when no one else could. And after that moment, Saul had David stay with him at the palace, which brought him into contact with Jonathan. And something shifted in Jonathan as all of this transpired. He knew that things were not going well with his father, but you have to think that he just assumed he was next in line. He was a prince, after all. But rather than double down on what he saw as his birthright, he chose a drastically different path. We don't get a lot of details, but we see this incredible bond of love form between these two men. Jonathan became one in spirit with David. He loved him as himself. And many years later, when Jonathan was killed in battle, David was grief-stricken. He lamented, "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me." There was more to this love than deep affection, though. It was expressed in profound and compelling ways, and in ways that for many of us feel difficult to grasp. We read that at one significant moment, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. There have been a lot of jokes made lately about the awkwardness of entering back into social situations after a year apart. And so I get if at this moment you're wondering, wait, is this normal? I honestly don't know anymore. We might see it simply as an act of disrobing, which, is a little awkward. I wouldn't recommend it at your first post-pandemic party. But there's something incredible happening here. Often when we see such an intimate relationship and disrobing, we would understandably assume that what we're seeing is sexual. But a closer look would show us that's not the dynamic here. Rather, what we're seeing is profoundly sacrificial. In the ancient Near East, your clothing meant something. Obviously, we all like to look sharp, at least from the waist up on our Zoom calls. But back then, they took it to a whole new level. Robes weren't status symbols, they were status itself. Robes, like the one Jonathan was wearing, acted as a wallet and safety deposit box all in one. They came with long tassels, and in these tassels was sewn money, rights to land and property, and other valuables. Robes were how inheritance was passed down from generation to generation. And we see their prominence plenty of other places in the Bible. The story of Joseph wasn't about having a fabulous coat of many colors. It was about having a fabulous coat of many tassels. Joseph's father loved him so much, he gave him a massive inheritance, even though he was one of the youngest and nowhere near the front of the line, which is why his brothers wanted to kill him. And in the famous parable of the prodigal son, when the son returns home, the father rushes out and puts the robe around him. That wasn't just because he was cold. The father was re-inheriting him back into the family. It demonstrates the lavish, generous love of God. Jonathan's robe, it was legit. Remember, he was the son of Saul, the prince of the entire kingdom, and it's likely that for his whole life, he had been groomed to be king. He had been told time and again that one day the throne would be his. The robe he wore, the princely robe, was a daily reminder of this. And yet, he recognized the work of God in David's life. Unlike his father, who would try to kill David several times over to prevent him from becoming king, Jonathan recognized God's dreams for David. He recognized that David, not he, would one day become king. And so he chose to literally lay it all down. His status, his inheritance, his claim to the kingdom, he laid it at David's feet. Now, at this point, if you've been following along with our Re-series for the past few weeks, you've heard us talk about self-sacrifices, singles, self-sacrifice in marriage, and now today, self-sacrifice in friendship. We seem to be really banging the drum here at High Rock. And why is that? It's because we believe Jesus' words when he said, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." We believe that to lose our lives for the sake of Jesus and loving others in Jesus' name is what will bring us to a full, joyful, and abundant life. And yet there are so many things in our world and in our hearts that pull us in the other direction. I want to save my life by saving it. As I shared earlier, I got tired of people I loved moving away. I got tired of continuing to put in the hard work that real friendship requires because it just got easier to keep it casual, focus on myself. And in those seasons when my own self-protectiveness and self-centeredness won out, it felt a little bit like I was saving my life at first. But ultimately, was I better off for it? No. Eventually it would catch up to me, the isolation, the lack of real joy in community, missing the significance of really being known by people who I love and trust, not being challenged to grow, not having opportunities to serve. That didn't make for a better, more whole life. It made for a very cold one. Some would argue that the only deep relationships we should have are with our spouses and immediate family, but that's clearly not what the scriptures teach or what God has in mind. The picture of spiritual friendship that we see in Jonathan and David and elsewhere in stories like Ruth and Naomi's and members of the early church is radically different than what we often settle for. It's a radical sacrifice that leads to radical life and radical joy. It's hard to overstate what Jonathan gave up for David. He set aside his comforts and privileges. He went against the will of his father, and his future was probably a lot less clear than it had been. But Jonathan saw what God was doing in David's life and also what God was doing in his own life. Jonathan had a different part to play in God's story, but it was an incredibly significant part. David would not have become king were it not for Jonathan. Jonathan warned David of Saul's plans to kill him and helped him escape numerous times. When Saul caught on, he tried to kill Jonathan as well, his own father. But Jonathan kept persisting in his relationship with David because their friendship wasn't disposable or shallow. It was based in covenant love. In our reading today, we heard that Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. Several times throughout their story, David and Jonathan affirm their love for one another through a covenant. A covenant is a formal commitment between two parties before God. It's a promise to lifelong loyalty and care no matter what. And today we see it happen almost exclusively in marriage, but that wasn't the case in the ancient Near East. They were far more common back then, and were made in a variety of contexts, from nations making peace with one another to individuals, just like David and Jonathan. It's a kind of commitment that is pretty alien in our world. Our commitments are more seasonal. Whereas here, Jonathan and David have promised to show each other and their families kindness all the days of their lives. After Jonathan died and David became king, David asked, "Is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He found Jonathan's son, who was lame in both feet, an outcast. And David brought him into the palace, gave him land, and he ate at the king's table for the rest of his life. Jonathan sacrificed much, but he and his family gained far more. And again, while this type of love and commitment between friends may feel foreign to us, it is the foundational theme of the Christian story. Jonathan has given us a beautiful and compelling picture of spiritual friendship, but Jesus brings it to the next level. Jonathan, a prince, befriended a shepherd boy, a total nobody, and laid down his right to the kingdom for David's sake. And in Jesus, God crossed time and space, putting aside splendor and glory to draw near to us, people who are lost and adrift, so that we might become a part of God's family. Jonathan was willing to risk his life for David, but as we just celebrated a few weeks ago, Jesus went to the cross for the joy set before him, so that we might be forgiven and set free. Jonathan befriends David, makes a covenant of kindness and love with him. And in Jesus, the God of all creation looks at us and says, "I have called you friends." And Jesus makes a covenant with us that we remember every week with communion, a covenant of unfailing love and kindness. Jesus calls us friends so that we might know what it means to be friends to others. He says greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus goes first so that we might follow him in this pattern of sacrificial love. Let's pause again for some questions and discussion. So what does this all look like? Am I suggesting that we just go from here and start making covenants with everyone we're friends with on Facebook? No, definitely not. But I think we should be considering ways that our friendships could be taking steps towards greater depth, value, and love. On our singles panel a few weeks ago, high rocker Jeremy Hinders shared honestly about fears that she and many others have about growing old and alone. And I grieve that. If our church is holding up this higher standard of friendship as mutual commitment and self-giving love, then that concern should be greatly diminished, if not wiped out altogether. As these single friends challenged us, we can become more. And even in these dark days of the pandemic, even when so many of our community members have been experiencing loneliness, I've seen ways that our relationships with our friends have started to shift. We have experienced a crisis that we could have never imagined, and out of that has come this common experience of grief and loss has changed how we talk with one another. In the past, my conversations often skewered towards superficial. When people ask me how I'm doing, I'd say, yeah, fine, thanks, right? It was pro forma. But in these past few months, my conversations have run so deep. We've cut through the glibness and chatter about sports and weather to get into how we're really doing. It doesn't mean conversations have just been hard and filled with pain. Many of them have been incredibly celebratory as we've been finding hope in following Jesus in powerful ways. I've talked with small group leaders who say they are experiencing new levels of depth in their friendships, even though they've known each other for years. They're just ready to talk about the big things that are happening. I spoke with one high rocker who sheepishly admitted that this has been an amazing year for him. Not because he's spending the whole time, on a beach somewhere, but because he has been connecting with God and others in powerful ways. And so many of the barriers of our busyness, our self-protection, and self-sufficiency have been breaking down. My family experienced this firsthand when we all got COVID back in February. It was so frustrating. I felt like we had almost made it. And when the initial scare subsided, we found ourselves wrestling with a lot of shame and embarrassment about it. We didn't really want anyone to know. We didn't like the idea of having to ask for help. But the reality is we needed some. We were trapped inside our apartment with our 3-year-old for weeks, again. And we began to let people in little by little, but before we knew it, the floodgates had been opened. We had so many offers for help and meals and CVS trips, we couldn't receive anywhere near all of them. God reminded us in that moment that not only were we not alone, but that we needed friends. We needed people to love us like Jesus does. I don't want to go back to the way of doing friendship that I often felt pulled into in the past. I want something more, and I hope that you find yourself wanting more too. Some of you might already have tight friendship groups and you just need some vision for how to go deeper. But others of us might be looking around and feeling a little alone. That was me after a few years in Boston, feeling discouraged by the constant comings and goings. And I knew a lot of people, but I needed some anchors. Some people who were in a similar stage of life with me, who I knew would be around for a little while. So I identified some guys who weren't going anywhere, and I made it a point to get time with them. This wasn't easy or natural or organic. It was intentional, and honestly, it felt costly at times. It took extra energy to initiate it. It took away from the me time that I had become so used to. We were actually pretty different from each other. Different backgrounds, ethnicities, personalities. There was a lot that I admired about them, their faith and their character, but it took work and effort to really get to know one another. We got into a pattern of hanging out maybe once a month, but over time, we became incredibly close. And part of what made those relationships so significant was that, like David and Jonathan, we were learning who God had made us and each other to be. Learning each other's stories, our passions, our struggles, inviting feedback and challenge, offering affirmation and support. True friendships have this spirit of mutual delight, just like Jonathan and David. Love and appreciation of the other. In a world where so often we hear voices of condemnation, we need friends to remind us of our worth as people loved by God and people who back that up with real action. We have to be the kind of friend that is willing to offer that, but at the same time, we have to understand that these biblical friendships are reciprocal. Friendships need to be containers where it is safe to be vulnerable and known. And if that isn't the case, then the friendship isn't ready for that kind of depth. One of the guys I've known for a long time, he's Taiwanese American. He's one of my closest friends in Boston. We've had numerous conversations about race and ethnicity in the past, but it was this year we really started going deeper. And for my part, I tried to ask more thoughtful questions and check in on him more regularly, which didn't feel like a natural move, but it was something I wanted to do intentionally as his friend. And he began letting me in on the fears he has walking his son down the street, his reluctance to have his parents come visit the States, his own inner struggles as an Asian man in America, and the constant burden of anger and sorrow that he carries. There are no easy answers to any of those things. As his friend, I wish I could, snap my fingers and instantly fix all of that. But I can't. But what I can do in this coming season is hold our friendship in a higher regard. To do the intentional work of loving him well, even if it feels different or even costly to me from a time or emotional energy standpoint or more. What are some things that you can sacrifice in order to be a better friend in this coming season? Jesus and Jonathan laid down their lives for their friends. That may not be what God is calling to you at this specific moment, but what would it take to make some intentional steps into deeper and more Christ-like friendships? When we follow Jesus, we see how Jesus made a commitment to love very imperfect people in ways that were often painful and challenging. He loved them all the way to the end of his life, even in the moment when he felt the most alone. That is what love is. And when we receive that love from Jesus, we become empowered to love as he does, abundantly and sacrificially in the ways that lead us to the full life Jesus promised for us. This can happen in daily ways that are spiritually significant. Perhaps it's taking the first step to just share a little more deeply, actually answering the question of, how are you doing? Maybe it's getting up early or staying up late so you can connect with a friend on their schedule. Maybe there's a material or financial need that they have in this moment or way you can help. Or thinking about words of encouragement that you can share or questions you can ask them that will honor them. Or even committing to praying for them regularly. Perhaps it's making the truly countercultural move to choose to stay here in Boston instead of pursuing that career, promotion, or retirement life somewhere else. Jonathan gave up an entire kingdom for his friend. What would it communicate to your friends if you chose to stay close to them out of love? Friendships take time to nurture and develop, so we shouldn't be so quick to leave them behind. Our culture values success, finances, and comfort over friendship, but we can show our culture a picture of the gospel by flipping that around. Being acquainted with someone, that's easy. But truly being someone's friend is hard. And guess what? It's going to be hard for someone to be your friend too. But don't let that discourage you. We know now more than ever that friendship is worth fighting for. And God is renewing the world through friendships. People who are committed to loving and serving one another even when it's hard, so that we might become who God has created us to be. Those are the kind of friendships I want to pursue in this coming season. And friends, I ask you, what is God inviting you to do?